Hello and welcome back to Breaking the Consensus here at Protect Life. Before we get going, I'd like to, first of all, thank you for joining us and bring your attention to that like and subscribe button. If you could click on that, make sure you'll get any new material that we produce, that you'll be told about that. Also, yeah, times are tough and we have a lot of fights in our hands, and that donate, if you can give anything at all, we appreciate. Times are difficult, but anything at all you can give would be really appreciated. We will use to the best of our ability. I'm really delighted tonight to have the opportunity to welcome Tom McClusky. Tom is a very well-known warrior for the pro-life cause in the United States, and Tom is going to be giving us a bit of background on the state of the State of the Union as regards pro-life issues after the recent midterms. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, Tom.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I'm honored.
So for the audience there that may not be following every detail of American politics up to the minute, can you just give us a shape of what the shape of the situation was before the midterms, maybe what the expectations coming in were, and how we have landed coming out?
I'm sure, and I'll try not to go that far back. I think most of your viewers might be are probably familiar with Roe v. Wade, which in 1973 imposed abortion on demand throughout the whole pregnancy and throughout all the United States. And there's been a lot of back and forth as we're trying to fight that. It was very similar to what you all are facing right now and what your great organization is fighting back right now after that referendum. However, it paid off. Hopefully, it was a good example. President Trump, Donald Trump, when he was elected, while there are certainly some things that you can disparage about Donald Trump, except on the life issue, he was surprisingly very much a champion. And thanks to him, we got 3 judges who believe in the U.S. Constitution onto the Supreme Court, which resulted in, during the Biden administration, the current administration, Roe v. Wade being overturned. And right now, there's a lot of debate about what's next. As we had 50 years to prepare for it, and I'm telling you right now, once you guys get rid of the referendum that you guys have, and I have full faith that you're going to, hopefully it doesn't take you 50 years like it took us. You're never prepared for what happens afterwards. The current makeup of Congress, unrelated to the life issue, is or prior to this year's elections was we had a Democratic president, self-described Catholic, Joe Biden, who has been probably the most pro-abortion president we've ever seen. I think in a largely because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They felt emboldened, and he passed a whole bunch of things that are questionably legal, questionably constitutional, that we're fighting back against. But also within Congress itself, it was democratically controlled. And in the United States, the Democratic Party has become the party of abortion. Currently in Congress, out of about I believe it was about 220 some odd members of the Democratic Party, when they were in the leadership, only one member in the House of Representatives was pro-life. And in the Senate, there's one who is pro-life, one Democrat is pro-life, and even that's questionable. Both of them have not been helpful in fighting back against what the Biden administration has been doing. After the elections were not a good, it was not a good night for pro-lifers overall. However, it's not that we didn't win. The Republicans did take over the House of Representatives, which that stops a lot of the agenda, the pro-abortion agenda and anti-family agenda that we were seeing from the Biden administration, from the Democrats. However, and we also there were 6 different throughout the year. There were 6 different constitutional amendments within each state. Now what Dobbs did, and what members of Congress, even our allies, don't understand, is that Dobbs said Roe v. Wade was wrong. The court should not have overstepped its boundaries. This should be left up to legislators. They did not say legislators. It did not say send it back to the states. They said it should be left up to legislators. And one thing we saw, though, one response within the states was a number of states put it up into ballot initiatives or referenda in each state. Now that it is up to the states to define what within their state is the pro-life cause, and there's been about 13, 14 states that have more or less outlawed abortion, even though it's tied up in the court somewhat, and there is still a federal role, and I'll get to that, but the state ballot initiatives were grossly, it was very similar to what happened in Ireland. I think it was grossly outspent. The pro-life side was. The media were not our friends. Any message that we had was not getting out there, and message and outright lies that the other side was saying were getting out there. In Montana, the state of Montana, there was a referendum simply that if a baby is born alive, they wanted to put it in the state constitution that healthcare professionals need to take care of that child. What the Democrats did in Montana, or pro-abortion forces did in Montana, was insist that this was an abortion ban. They kept on insisting that this would affect your health care, that people would die, and the media just gave them a pass. And that happened in a number of different states, where, I mean, just looking at some of the numbers, because there were certain states, California, Michigan, and Vermont, that offered up amendments to codify the abortion, to put abortion in their state constitutional amendments, making it harder for even the most simplest of things like parental notification, or some of these constitutional amendments can actually force taxpayers to pay for abortions within those states when they couldn't before. But in a state like California, those who supported abortion spent $14.9 billion. Those who were on the pro-life side only spent $292,000. And we see in Michigan, those who support abortion spent $45 million, whereas those who support life only spent $17 million. So we were severely outspent. Except the whole night wasn't a loss, and let me give some positives before I go back into the negatives. When candidates were on the offense, they won. Every pro-life incumbent, except for one on the national level, won his reelection. That includes a number of governors who were very outspoken on the life issue. Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida, Governor Abbott in the state of Texas. I mean, Ron DeSantis in Florida won by almost 20%. And while there are a number of issues, he was people believe he handled the COVID issue very well. He didn't shut down businesses. He didn't shut down schools. He's been doing a lot to fight back against corporate culture, corporate woke culture, corporations who want to impose values that would be seen outside of being Catholic, being outside of Christian belief, or many people. He fought against Disney in the state of Florida, and if you're familiar with the state of Florida, that's where Disney World is. Sure. That is the heart of Disney, and he fought back against Disney and won. Except he also signed a 15-week bill into place. He's been unspoken pro-life. The senator from that state, Marco Rubio, also won re-election by large measures. And he is probably one of the, if not the most outspoken pro-life senator we have. So there were a lot of good things from that night.
So just to take, you say, let's look at the positives. I think the DeSantis story is maybe definitely, because both DeSantis and Rubio are out front. They're not hiding on the issue. They have very strong positive pro-life message. And DeSantis goes from winning by what, 30,000 votes to a blowout, basically. I mean, they talked about the red wave, which didn't happen. Florida had this red tsunami almost. It's a massive. He flips Miami-Dade. And a couple of things that I thought were interesting that come out of that. But one is, he scores very well with Latino voters. Now, I'm just thinking, going forward from here, in the United States, like pretty well everywhere in the rest of the world, in the Western world, we hear increasingly about polarization on both sides. But the Democratic coalition relies on this coalition of African American voters, suburban liberal whites in the Northeast, highly educated, blah. But Latinos are part of that coalition, and it does seem that now Republicans are speaking to that. And isn't it true that actually, when you poll Latinos, Hispanics, and African Americans, that very often they are more conservative on social issues than the Democratic Party is, and that if we can find a way of speaking to these voters properly, that there is hope going forward of creating a new coalition, a new pro-life coalition.
And we first saw this formed, I think, under President Trump in his election, his first election, and during it, he did outreach to those communities, the Black community. He got more of the Black vote and Hispanic vote than any other Republican president, I think, had prior. What Ron DeSantis did was very similar. We always know, or we always believed, that at least for the first couple of generations, a lot of Hispanics coming over. For African Americans, the church is a lot of time. For Blacks in America, the church is the centerpiece a lot of times of their community. So recognizing those values is important, except I think for Republicans for the longest time, we just got angry, like, oh, why we believe the same way they do on the life issue, on marriage. Mm-hmm. Why don't they come and vote for us instead of talking to them? And that's what you saw Ron DeSantis did. And the election law, there's a lot of hubbub about the election laws being fraudulent and such in the United States. While it's certainly not a perfect system, I don't think you win by complaining about the rules. You see what the rules are and you adapt to them. And that's what Ron DeSantis did as well. And that's how he flipped Miami-Dade, where mail-in balloting, where you can vote weeks, if not a month or so prior to the election. He did outreach early, because some people are voting before they see any debates or anything like that. He did outreach early to those communities, sometimes speaking their language, and be it different forms of Spanish, and reaching out. And what they found was that's what turned Miami-Dade red, was a lot of the mail-in balloting and things along those lines. Ron DeSantis went for those votes and he got those votes. Kind of like, I think, Donald Trump went for those votes and got for those votes. Whereas in the past, Republicans sat back and said, we are who we are, vote for us, and didn't really work for those votes.
Just, I'm wondering, you raised an interesting point there, that he went after that early vote and he had early outreach. Just on a tactical point, there has been some criticism of the Republican strategy in this election, that they put everything, they back-ended the campaign, and the Democrats came in early, and they established a narrative, and then when the money came out, when the money came in for the Republicans, it was too late. Do you think that maybe that one of one of the lessons from DeSantis is that you have to get out early there, particularly when so much voting is happening in the ballots and the early voting?
I think without a doubt, and there's a special runoff in Georgia next month for a Senate election. And at least for one of the organizations I work for, Catholic Vote, which gets involved in elections, and I know Susan B. Anthony List, which is another pro-life organization that tries to elect pro-life candidates. In Georgia, we're trying out these new things, getting out there early, making sure the message is out there early before mail-in balloting is being done, and also making sure that we're reaching our audience. For Catholic vote, we've reached out to some of the larger Catholic churches. Because one thing we found is that for be it Catholics or evangelicals, if you are a regular churchgoer at least once a week, my wife wouldn't call that a regular churchgoer. She'd say that you're just a weekly, a regular is every day. And she's not wrong. However, if you're a weekly churchgoer, you're more likely to vote for the person with the conservative values. But the problem is that we saw a lot in rural America where a lot of those voters are, they did not come out to vote. Okay. And I think one thing, we need to look at the rules that are in a state, and instead of complaining about them, we need to adapt to them. And there's something called ballot harvesting where you help people, they can vote from the comfort of their home and you go and pick up the ballot. You want to make sure that there is no fraud involved there, except a church can be a ballot harvesting place. And we want to try to convince more churches that you don't need to get involved in politics. The Catholic Church in the United States, and I think it's true in Ireland as well, sometimes tends to avoid politics to their detriment. However, all you're doing is encouraging people to vote. And here in the United States, the church has always encouraged people to be good citizens and to vote. So now we're asking those churches to harvest ballots.
And just, you talked about getting the message out. In the context of Dobbs, you said it at the head of the show, something I think very interesting. You're never prepared. So for 50 years, in a sense, all of the energy, the focus, and the message of the life movement in the United States has been towards the overturning of Roe. Do you think part of the problem this time around was that the movement hasn't yet fully worked out what the next message is, that they still have to coalesce around a new message, a new theme, a new way of speaking to people? Because now that Roe's gone, it must have left a vacuum in a sense. Well, what do we say now? Where do we go? What do we do? What direction do we need to do? I think that maybe was one of the problems, that you talk about getting a message, but the message, you haven't quite got around to working out exactly what the message needs to be yet. And I'm not saying that's a criticism, because that's not going to be easy.
I don't see it as a criticism either. And I've actually brought this up at coalition meetings that I've had with other pro-life organizations, is that because it was somewhat, it did come somewhat of as a shock. I mean, I can remember a year before the Dobbs decision being at a coalition meeting and nobody was talking about overturning Roe. It was just basically how we were going to be working in the same framework of that we have for the last 50 years. And there was a gap. And if being in the pro-life movement, I know you know this, there's no movement, I think, more dysfunctional and functional both at the same time.
Yeah.
While we were all celebrating, we all had different views about how to go forward. And sometimes it's arguing about the size of the table. It might be inconsequential, but when you're in the moment, it seems consequential. However, this left a gap for the Biden administration and for the media to fill. And to fill people full of, oh, like how horrible this is for women. Except one thing is, historically in the United States, midterm elections, that's elections when a president is elected for 4 terms. Usually in the middle of his term, there's always House and Senate elections, and there's a big turnover from whichever party's in the White House loses. However, historically, there's been different examples where that hasn't happened. One is during Jimmy Carter's midterm elections, and you had Watergate prior to that, and the Democrats didn't lose as many seats. After the bombings of September 11th, 2001, you had George W. Bush's midterm elections in 2002. And I think Americans were just like, okay, they were still reeling, and Republicans actually won seats in that midterm. And here, just as earth-shaking as some of those other events, is Dobbs. And what I loved was after the Dobbs decision, because a lot of us were still trying to figure what's the next steps, what do we do next? And the other side is putting out newspaper articles talking about Ever since Texas's heartbeat legislation passed, 20,000 abortions haven't happened. And since Dobbs, I think the number is like 30 or 60,000 abortions haven't happened because of Dobbs. As a pro-lifer, I looked at those headlines and I said, oh, because of the Texas bill, 20,000 babies are alive today that wouldn't have been alive. 30,000 or 40,000 babies are alive today because of the Dobbs decision that wouldn't have been alive. And I've told some of my allies, and I haven't heard any disagreement, I will take a bad election cycle in exchange for saving babies' lives.
Yeah. Sorry, could you actually just explain to people there that there are a lot of states had set up legislation in a, shall we say, a ready-to-go posture, that in the case that the court overturned Roe, and as I mean, to make clear to people, Roe did not, getting rid of Roe didn't make abortion illegal. It just said that it shouldn't be considered to be a right found in the Constitution, and it was therefore goes back to the legislature at a federal level or the local level. But when it was a constitutional right, then even the local states weren't in a position to legislate against access to abortion. But there were these pieces of legislation which were ready to go. Can you just talk a little bit about that, the number of states that did that, and what kind of effect that's having?
Well, there were about laws ready to go, and I like that description much better. Over here in the United States, we call them trigger laws, which is a horrible term for it. Laws ready to go. I'm going to steal that from you. So
You're welcome.
There were about altogether about almost 24 states out of 50 that had different laws on the books. Some were laws that existed before Roe and were never taken off the books. That was the case in Michigan, the state of Michigan. Some were laws that were as ready to go laws, such as in Arkansas, I believe there was a law like that. And then in some states, I mean, the states that had the most to do with overturning Roe, the most immediate to do with overturning Roe, were the state of Texas, where there was a heartbeat law, and the state of Mississippi, where it was a 15-week law. Now, in a lot of those states now, because it has been left up to the states, and some of those states, it's back in the state courts now. So not all those states are abortion free, but there are at least about, I think right now there are about 6 or 7 states that are abortion free. I always wish goodwill for everybody, but the New York Times and other liberal newspapers, when they have these newspaper articles about how the last abortion clinic in Mississippi closed, that's when I break out the champagne.
Right now, you mentioned the number 60,000. What we're looking at as a consequence of Dobbs, there are 60,000 Americans were alive that would not otherwise have been. And that's a tremendous thing in and of itself.
And those numbers are probably incomplete, because there are a number of states that don't have never listed the number of abortions they do, and some of them are the biggest states where abortions happen, California and New York. And also the biggest scourge currently facing the pro-life movement that we are struggling on how to respond to, of course, is chemical abortions. So the state of Texas, while it might be illegal to have an abortion, unfortunately, there's ne'er-do-wells who then mail in these pills for a woman to basically have an abortion on her commode. It's horrible, and this is how because they see it's, and that's one thing we're trying to fight against. We're trying to realize what kind of laws we can pass and what kind of education we can do to let people know that. Because if we don't, those abortion numbers could actually increase if more and more people rely on the chemical.
It's also incredibly irresponsible, because if you don't have you don't have a scan, and you don't know at what stage the pregnancy is, and you procure a chemical abortion, you're also putting the mother's life at risk. This can be potentially dangerous for women as well. I mean, it's very just handing these things out or doing it without proper supervision. It's irresponsible.
And it's we've had, it's anecdotal right now. I mean, news stories, except I'd expect an increase of this. There's also men who are giving abortion pills to women without their knowledge, as well.
Wow.
We've seen stories increase on that. I don't have any hard numbers. However, I mean, it just goes back to how abortion, there's a phrase like abortion empowers women, that's like on signs that people hold up when they're, I mean, abortion empowers men and not good men. So
we're 2 years out from the next presidential. And one thing I'm aware of when I follow American politics a bit like, somebody might follow a baseball team or a horse, if nothing else, it's
I would think
entertainment.
more like a reality show, like.
But gosh, you guys, it goes on a long time. I mean, basically, as a friend of mine said, it's 2 years out, so that means that the presidential campaign will start in 6 months' time.
Well, President Trump already announced his reelection.
Yeah.
Except the thing is, there is the election, I think, will be good for the pro-life movement because it'll allow us to focus. It'll give us something to focus on. We'll try to find candidates who can articulate our position. Usually, especially in a Republican primary, you're going to see people, they fight to move, because in primaries, the more conservative candidate wins. So they're going to fight to the right.
Sure.
And I'm hoping it gives us more focus. A lot will depend on who the nominee is. I know there are 2 or 3 out there who are thinking of announcing who are not pro-life. But I do think those like Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, from Texas, or President Trump, I think will have the best chance at somebody's outspokenly pro-life.
If you go back to the 60s, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but pre-Roe up to, being pro-life was a perfectly respectable position within the Democratic Party. And many of the most prominent advocates, pro-life advocates at the time would have been from the party. Within the Republican Party, you still had those, shall we say, the Northeastern Republican, sort of Rockefeller Republicans, who would have been much more easy about, say, taking a pro-abortion stance. It is undoubted that it's become a polarizing issue. Do you think, is this just the reality of how it is with the politics, or is it a problem for the life movement, that the life movement is so closely associated with a party, and that it's impossible for Democrat, like, if the Democratic platform is just pro-abortion and that's it, and that it's very hard to see the possibility of growing coalitions? You said there's one Democrat in the House, one Democrat in the Senate, and that's it. Is that the way it is now? Is that the politics, or do you think it's possible to, in some sense, decouple the issue from the party politics?
I think it is possible. One thing, and you aren't doing this, but one thing I hear sometimes from the media on this side of the aisle is basically that it's the pro-life movement's fault. It's not bipartisan on the national level, at least. Except the simple truth that I used to work for the March for Life, in the annual march here in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. In our archives, we had pictures of Joe Biden fundraising for the March for Life. However, he knew if he wanted to run for president, first time he did in 1988, he needed to be pro-abortion. Same as with Jesse Jackson, the famous preacher over here. Sure. Al Gore used to be pro-life. And the reason there's only one pro-life Democrat right now, currently, it's Henry Cuellar from Texas, is because the Democratic Party ran out the others that were there. Dan Lipinski was a well-known Democrat from Michigan, and he was run out. But when you look to the state level, and that's where I think as organizations, as we look more to the national organizations, look more to work in the states, it's more and more we're partnering with Democrats. In Louisiana, a speaker we had numerous times at the March for Life is a state senator. Well, she was a state representative at first. Now she's a state senator, Katrina Jackson, African-American Democrat, who is a leader on the pro-life issue in the state of Louisiana. And that's true the more and more in a lot of other states as well. What I'd like to see is that some of us on the state level start convincing those people to run for national office. So that because one thing this last election, the Republicans did increase their numbers in Congress, but those numbers include a number of the Northeast corridor that you spoke of that are not pro-life. I would prefer everybody be pro-life. And since the numbers are going to be small, it's going to make it hard to pass pro-life legislation with those people there. Those who don't support the life issue. However, at the same time, having a Republican majority in the House of Representatives stops a lot of bad legislation that this administration wants to see passed. So it's a double-edged sword.
I know you're saying. I remember, I think it's a quote from about like this stage 30 years ago, Senator Daniel Moynihan, who himself I think would have been pro-choice, pro-abortion, talking about the way that the abortion lobby had basically destroyed the party, that it had become impossible for any kind of diversity. And that was long before this became, if you like, a shibboleth within the Republican Party, that it had taken over the Democrats. I'm just curious, it's interesting, you mentioned the Democrat from Texas, you mentioned their state senator from Louisiana. Are we looking at a simple fact that there is just a massive cultural difference between what it means to be a Democrat in Texas or Louisiana or perhaps in Tennessee or Alabama than it is to be a Democrat in Southern California or New York, and that gives an opportunity for a pro-life movement to maybe to reach out to that culture, that democratic culture?
I definitely think so, except it's not just in red states or in I mean I believe that in certain within red states there's also sometimes Democratic strongholds, and mainly and a number of them might be populated with a number of African Americans or Hispanics. So find someone who is maybe fiscally more on the liberal side, except is pro-life and pro-family, and a pro-life group should get behind those people. Tulsi Gabbard, former congresswoman from Hawaii, she didn't always vote right. Her father is actually state representative in Hawaii, a state senator there. He is very pro-life, Democrat, Catholic, and now Tulsi, if you follow her at all, even though she's outside of Congress, she is adamantly pro-life too now. It would have been better if she was in office, of course, but it's just as the Republican Party needs to do more in outreach to Hispanics and African American community, the pro-life movement needs to not only do outreach, because I think there is a lot of partnership within those communities. We need to start encouraging them to that I might not agree with 100% of your politics, but I agree with you on life. I agree with you on marriage. I want to back you for Congress. I want to back you for the state legislator. We need to start compromising in that way, I think. And I think we would see a real cultural shift.
Maybe instead of, and I'm aware that at times people the word compromise is used and people negatively, but maybe it's not compromise, it's coalition building. And what we are about is, trying to find, this is the central issue for us. This is the central value. We have other values. We're not single issue voters, but that if you go down and we saw some of the numbers from the Hispanic communities along the Texas border, which were incredible results there, but reflecting the fact that these people were very strongly pro-family, very strong sense of life, also tend to be religious, maybe more fiscally, left wing, but on those key issues. And I wonder, and I don't know, that's why I'm asking you, is if perhaps at the now or in the past there have been what we might call lonely Democrats out there that could be helped, that because of their values, they're not getting the kind of help from the institutional backers from in the Democratic Party. But the pro-life movement could come along and say, okay, we're not, we see your real commitment to these values and these issues, and we can help you along. And they would speak to their community, and then that kind of coalition building could be very fruitful.
I think that's true, even in general, and we do need to do more of that. A lot of our pregnancy care centers are centered in those communities. But it isn't just because Republicans are not the answer to everything either. I mean, I've dealt with too many politicians who are out, who proclaim pro-life and will give a really hearty speech and everything, and when it comes time to vote, it's like, like, can't we handle this issue instead? It's when I was at Family Research Council prior to working at the March for Life, and it's an evangelical organization here in the United States. Dealt a lot with evangelical churches, and what we tried to do was work with pastors in churches and say, can you identify people within your congregation that you think maybe should go into public office? And not necessarily right away we're going to run you for president, but run for school board elections this past year. Conservatives had a very good year for school board elections. A lot of it was in reaction, I think, to COVID restrictions and things along those lines, and a lot of the woke culture within the American public school system. But asking these people in the pews to do more and to run for office, and just as that's true among white churches, we also need to do that for African American and Hispanic churches, and for the pro-life movement. Under that's where the compromise, I guess you're right. That's where my wife works more in the pro-life movement as well, and she works for the Catholic Church more on the ministerial side. And I always explain that the legislative side of the pro-life movement is probably the worst part of the movement, because what is the art of legislating? It's the art of compromise. And what are you going to compromise on when you're talking about life? It's very hard to do, but maybe this is where the compromise is, because a number of us also are fiscally conservative and all. And, if it elects more pro-life legislators, that my ultimate goal is to make abortion unthinkable. And if in the in-between time I need to pay a few extra taxes or something, I'm okay with that.
You said that one of the problems in the midterms was that there were a lot that some of those rural voters, perhaps the rural voters that were invisible before, and were one of the reasons why Trump was such a surprise, because suddenly these voters appeared that had appeared to be disengaged, had dropped out of the political discourse and appeared. They didn't. That rural vote maybe didn't come out as strongly this time. Is there something? Do you think is there a message that you can craft that will speak to them to motivate that vote when it comes to a presidential, or do you think it's just the nature of the beast that at this type of election midterm they're going to be less motivated, but come a presidential, if they have a candidate to vote for, they'll come out?
I think Ron DeSantis is the perfect example here. Give him something to vote for. With Donald Trump, multi-billionaire, I can't really speak to his character, except he had a message to folks in the United States that I know you feel like you're being ignored. You feel like you're not part of it anymore, that your vote just doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you, I'm going to shake things up. And he did. With Ron DeSantis, the mainstream media tried to cancel him. Disney fought against him, and he fought back. And the thing, people like somebody who's going to fight, who has a message, and it was both a positive message, except also a message of, I'm not going to take it anymore. And I think when we saw candidates like that, you need to inspire people to come out. that solves a lot of problems. And when that doesn't happen, I think it's then left up to groups that work within the United States and work on elections to give that inspiration. Like, okay,
Mhm.
you know, this person might not be because they all can't be champions. This person might not be a champion, except because of him makes the difference between if we have a pro-life Supreme Court or one that will return us to Roe v. Wade.
I don't expect you to have an answer because you don't appear to have a crystal ball there. But since you're here, I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you think that Biden will run again? And if
Um,
he are in fact, are you saying novenas that he will run again?
well, I work in politics, so there's never a question that I would admit I can't answer. All indication is that he will. I mean, if he doesn't, I think the Democrats are actually in more trouble if he doesn't, because they don't really have a strong base. They don't really have a strong bench right now.
Mhm.
He indicates he will. It's just going to be very interesting. There's questions about his mental health. Except, to be honest, when he had I think he had an aneurysm or a stroke back in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. And there were questions back then, except he's certainly proven himself. It will be, if he's going to run or not, I think he wants to. Let me say that. If he'll actually be able to, and I think Joe Biden wants him to run again, if he'll actually be able to. Because remember, the last election, he ran it from his basement, or he did it from
Yeah,
his basement.
it was
This
a
election,
front
it'll be
porch
very
campaign.
different. Right. This election will be very different. So it'll be a lot harder for him not to barnstorm across the nation. He just turned 80 yesterday. Speaking, my wife is not the same age as him, except I did not realize it. We've been married 15 years, did not realize it. They shared the same birthday. But very different politics. As I explained to somebody yesterday on Facebook, one is a devout Catholic, one is the president of the United States.
But doesn't have to worry about where she goes to church, if she's going to get communion or not.
Right. I've in the 20 years we've known each other, I've never seen her denied communion. So I think that's the big question. Another question is, if Donald Trump is running again, what does that mean? I'm glad to see that other candidates are not backing out once even though Donald Trump is announced. To me, I see all this debate and all as healthy. And that's why when there's friction within the pro-life movement here in the United States, it's healthy. As long as you respect each other, we would not have overturned Roe v. Wade. The laws in the states that passed to overturn Roe v. Wade were actually opposed by the majority of national groups. So if it was up to them, Roe v. Wade would probably still be the law of the land. However, the Supreme Court would not be where it is today with Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh without the national groups. So even though they were at conflict, we both got the result that we wanted, the overturning of Roe.
Okay. Before I let you go, there's just one last question, speaking to our own situation here. You're in kind of the opposite problem. Having spent 50 years trying to overturn Roe, you've succeeded. You've overturned Roe, and now you're looking to try and craft or define a new message. Where do we go from here? We have spent the last, I suppose, 40 years defending the Eighth Amendment. And maybe that made us complacent. Maybe we thought, well, we have this now, we don't have to worry. But I know for a fact, the day after we won the Eighth Amendment, the other side started to work, and they didn't stop working every single day. And maybe we took some days off. So we're in the other situation now. We're having spent all this time talking about defending the Eighth, we now have to find a new message, a new way to go forward. If you're just looking at your own experience, is there any one thing that you would say to the various groups here, or to the to the wider pro-life community, that one little piece of advice or one piece of experience that you have had from the American that you'd share with us?
Numbers are important. Numbers seem like inconsequential when we're talking about something like life. However, if we had the data early on, and if we had forced on the national level compiling data of the number of abortions, because when Roe v. Wade passed, it was like, oh, there will be like 20,000 abortions a year.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions of abortions every year, and that we know of, because California and New York, as I said, I think that if people understood the horrors of those numbers, and in addition, making sure that, because this past year, the pro-abortion side spent at least $540 million on this election, be it on state initiatives, be it on candidates. They get taxpayer funding on both the federal and state level. They get about $560 million. While it's two different pools we're talking about, money is fungible. And if we had known back when we started the Title X program, and when abortion is defined as a healthcare right here in the United States by the Internal Revenue Service, by our tax system, if we had known what was going to result from that back in the 1970s, when it was a lot easier to pass pro-life legislation because you had both parties, there were a number of people who were pro-life. Mm-hmm. If I could go back in time, that type of stuff, I think we would have gotten to overturning Roe a lot earlier. Because it's people don't think about it every day like we do, and they have families to support, they have jobs. Yeah. But the horrors of the numbers when you think about it, and one advice that is kind of Ireland specific is, I mean, I worry about the churches here in the United States. We need to build up our churches again. And sometimes I believe that, at least for the Catholic Church, where it's time for the lay people to start stepping up, if you don't think you're more. Mm-hmm. Because the churches are very strong supporters here, both financially as well as just foot soldiers. The March for Life, which I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people come every year. Most of them are coming because their diocese said come. So we really need to strengthen our churches, and those leaders within our churches, we need to build them up.
Thank you. Listen, Tom, it's been great to talk to you. I'm hoping that we'll be able to persuade you to come back another time to talk again.
I'd be happy to.
But for this evening, I'd like to thank also those watching out there. As I say, press the subscribe button. Anything you can donate will be used to our best to forward those life causes that we all hold dear. Thank you, and good night, and God bless. Thank you all, and thank you again, Tom McClusky.
Thank you.